record whenever you're ready. Thank you for joining us. My name is Paul Crane. I'm a spokesman for the Fiscal Alliance Foundation. The Fiscal Alliance Foundation promotes individual liberty and greater fiscal responsibility and transparency in government for a better New England through education and legal assistance. We often do polls to gauge how the public views issues and topics and policies and candidates. This is our fourth poll of the year, the first one that primarily looks at primary voters. And I know that's a hot topic since early voting will start on Saturday and mail-in voting has already begun. We did look at some of the things we usually look at, like how the president is performing in his job, how primary viewers view him. We looked at some Massachusetts issues, particularly the two ballot questions that are now appearing before us. And then we dove right into the contested primaries for the Republican and Democrat side. I realize it is late August and there's a lot of people on vacation. So we'll probably be kind of brief and just open it up to questions. With us is Jim Eltraham, who's our pollster, and he will dive into it as well. The first thing I want to point your attention to, and you should have a copy of the poll and our press release, is we asked primary voters on the Republican and Democrat side how they view the president's job performance, how he's handling the economy and inflation. And consistent with our previous polls of general election voters, Republican primary voters also have a very strong negative opinion to how the president is handling those things, with overall job performance and inflation coming in the highest at 87% negative when you add in the somewhat and hard negatives. And then flip that over to the Democrat primary side, and you'll see that the president's job performance, handling the economy and inflation is pretty high, which is a little bit different from when you look at general election voters, which right now the president is upside down in Massachusetts. His worst showing was with inflation with Democrat primary voters at 78%, and the highest is at 90% for overall job performance. So that's worth noting. We did ask a question for primary voters, basically the typical right track, wrong track question. And you see two different pictures here in Massachusetts. Republican primary voters, about 67% say wrong track for the state, 79% say right track with Democrats. We did ask about the legislatures, delayed or derailed, however you want to kind of phrase it, tax relief and reform package. What was interesting there was that 42% of Republican primary voters basically don't think it should proceed forward. I'm sorry, 42% do think and 49% don't think. And that's probably has a lot to do with how Republicans view government intervention to help the economy right now, and especially with some of the negative press that the legislature has received for not delivering on their promises. Amongst Democrat primary voters, 53% say yes, it should proceed, 29% say no. And so again, that's not really that high. It is a majority, but it isn't where I think it would normally be. And that's, again, I think due to some of the negative press that it has received. As we all saw yesterday in the news, it looks like there will be a ballot question for repealing giving driver's license to illegal immigrants. We asked this question for primary voters, and as the advocates who are putting this on the ballot noted yesterday, I think they have over 100,000 signatures they handed in. They only need 40,000 certified roughly. And this issue really polls really high. I think it's actually the highest issue that we saw amongst Republicans, at 90% don't think illegal immigrants should have driver's license. Only 8% yes. With Democrat primary voters, 60% say yes, they should receive. 26% say no. What will be interesting to see is how this shapes out over the next few months, considering there hasn't been a ballot question in the works for a while. This is kind of brand new. And we'll have to see how this looks when you add in kind of general election unenrolled voters and how the overall numbers look like. But very strong feelings on that issue. And then we went to our typical language for the grad tax question. But again, difference is that this is primary voters. So with Republicans, 85% no, which is kind of what I would think it would be at. I know there's been some other polls out there asking Republican, just general voters, and it shows a lesser number for no, but amongst primary voters, it's 85% with Republicans. And then on the Democrat side, for the grad tax question, it was 43% say yes for the tax, 34% say no, and then 23% unsure. So I thought that was also interesting. It wasn't a majority support for the yes on the Democratic primary side yet. We did ask the question, kind of a new issue, obviously, is that 1986 ballot question that was passed that is set to rebate about $3 billion back to the taxpayers. This is the only issue that unified Republican and Democrat primary voters. With GOP, 63% say yes, and with Democrats, 65%. So it seems like a ballot question approved by the voters has a very strong support level today, and hopefully that will be delivered to every Massachusetts taxpayer, because it is highly touted amongst primary voters. Pretty high numbers there. I don't really see that very often with issues, especially with tax issues. I do want to go into the candidate one-on-one issues, but the one-on-one horse race questions, but I wanted to stop and ask Jim if he wants to add anything at this point.
Oh, thanks, Paul. It was an interesting survey to look at, and to look at the way primary voters are breaking down, looking at the issue preferences and the issue reactions of the people who are choosing the candidates. Whereas a lot of the other polls that we've done this year, I think all of them have been focused on looking at the electorate in general, the people are going to show up on election day. So it's always interesting to see how this subset of voters performs. And I'll share Paul's note about the support for the tax rebate question. Seeing that support just across the line, almost at the same level between Republican and Democratic voters, it was nice. It was nice to see everyone agree on something. So, but no, always interesting to see the preferences of the people who pick the candidates versus the people who go to the polls.
Definitely. All right, so we'll jump into the head-to-head right now. And Jim, you definitely have to fill in parts that I miss here. I know we've been asked about this a lot with our previous polls that focus on general election voters. So, with early voting starting, we wanted to do a poll right before people can kind of go out there and vote. And obviously they're voting now with mail-in voting. This poll was done on Monday and Tuesday this week, so it is pretty fresh, but we'll go right into it. As you see in the press release, there are several candidates who are kind of just teetering in the single digits. You will see that on the Democrat side. For the lieutenant governor race, Kim Driscoll is at 13%. She's leading the pack, but you still have 72% who are undecided in that race, which is pretty amazing. And remember, these are primary voters who have a history of voting in primaries and who are going to vote in this primary. Eric Lesser's at 9, Tammy Guevara is at 6. So I think it's fair to say that's pretty wide open. For the Attorney General race, you have Campbell at 25, Palfrey at 5%, and I'm not going to pronounce her name correctly, but Liz Reardon at 20%. Virtually 49% are undecided, so you're starting to see a little bit more preference there. And then this one shouldn't come as a surprise because you have an incumbent running in the primary, but it definitely stuck out. For the Secretary of State's race, William Galvin, again, the longtime incumbent, he's at 55%. And Sullivan's at 14, undecided at 31. This is the only primary race with Republicans and Democrats where anyone received the majority of support. For the auditor race on the Democrat side, Dempsey's at 15, DeZoglio 10, undecided 75. So a lot like the lieutenant governor race. Basically 3 out of 4 primary voters don't have a decision yet. So I would say anything is quite possible there. We did poll the GOP race. Jeff Deal at 42, Chris Doughty at 27, undecided 31. What I think is pretty interesting on this one is that, the GOP, like all these primaries, they're kind of in the midst of probably the last stage, I would say right now. So you definitely, I would say, see movement. I'm sure the 2 campaigns have seen movement, but as of Monday, Tuesday, that's where things are at with the Republican primary for governor. I noted in the press release, I think Chris Doughty got 29% of the convention. So I also thought that was kind of interesting. I had to recall what did he earn there. So 29 and 27%, it seems like that's where he's at. The LG's race for the Republican side, almost 70% are undecided on that one. So that will be interesting to see how that pans out. Leah Allen at 13, Kate Campanell at 19%. One thing to note there is that for the Republican primary, there's people who, these are people who are coming out to vote, who have voted, and they have some preferences on the governor's race, and it seems like they have less preference on the LG race. So, I think, obviously they run independently of each other, but they're kind of a ticket. And I think the campaigns are going to have to really focus on making sure that message is out there the next few days of what their ticket is. We asked also primary voters the same question we asked general election voters in our poll, which are what are the issues that motivate you when you go to vote in this upcoming election? For the GOP side, again, this economic anxiety issue seems to be front and center. Inflation 33, jobs economy at 19, which again, jobs economy has to do with inflation. But when we ask this question for general election, it's usually taxes are also very high. In this case, rule of law issue came up as number 3 at 16%. And obviously, again, looking at that question of the driver's license for illegal immigrants, that's a 90% issue for Republican primary voters. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that they're also motivated on those types of issues when they go to vote this primary season. On the Democrat side, the number 1 issue is climate change, number 2 is healthcare, and number 3 is inflation. So again, you see inflation still at the minds of even Democrat primary voters. Not as intense as the other issues, but it's still there. So I do want to stop and ask Jim if he has any comments, any observations at this point with the head-on-head candidates.
There was one thing that I thought was interesting was the high undecideds for the lieutenant governor races in both parties. And it was and Paul and I talked a little bit about this yesterday. I thought it was interesting that, and again, as Paul mentioned, this is a poll of people who have a history of voting in primaries, high likelihood of voting in this one, and we do a screen at the top of the poll too to gauge which primary they're voting in, but also gauge their likelihood to vote. And in both cases, you have people who are kind of going to the polls for the primary and saying they're up in the air on the lieutenant governor election, which is interesting to me because it's something that appears on the primary ballot, but not necessarily on the general election ballot. So it was just something that tickled the political science nerd in me to see that and see that across both parties, see that phenomenon across both parties was interesting.
Yeah, and giving advice to any of the campaigns there, I would say look at those undecided voters and figure out what are their issues, which is in the crosstab data, and you can get a good sense for what's on their minds, those undecided voters. For the Republican side, there's a question out there: is it that are they what you consider more conservative leaning voters who are just not yet sure who to vote for, or are they more moderate kind of establishment voters? And you can look at all that data in the crosstabs, and you can do it with the Democrat side too. So I think that's probably some unfinished business in the next couple of weeks before primary days. Those campaigns really need to talk to those people. So I want to open up to any questions. Just unmute yourself. I think, Colin, you're the only reporter who's joining us right now, but I know there's many others who want to watch this later. So.
Excellent. Well, hopefully I'll help them out too. I think this is probably this question is probably best for Jim. I noticed in what was sent over that you do blend in unenrolled voters. I was hoping you could talk about sort of that process of how you try to match the sort of likely electorate for these primary contests, and how you sort of try to parcel out those unenrolled voters as either likely to vote in a Republican primary or likely to vote in a Democratic primary.
The primary thing we do, and that's a good question, Colin. The primary thing we do is look at vote history in both cases. And we generally have a good record of, when people have voted, where what ballot they've pulled. And so we start with that. Nothing predicts future performance like past behavior. And on top of that, we do ask them, okay, in this election specifically, which ballot are you planning to pull? Which primary you're planning to vote in? So it's a little bit of a double screen, and that's how we do our best to determine whether or not they're highly likely to vote in one primary or the other. I would never say anything is perfect 100%, but we try to use past behavior as much as possible as a predictor of future behavior. So if someone is, first of all, if someone's a registered Republican, they're still voting in the Republican race. But for those unenrolled voters who might go back and forth, we look and try to see, okay, are they people who tend to vote in the Democratic primary? Are they people who tend to vote in the Republican primary? Or, and on top of that, are they people who are, where do they say they're coming down in this one? And so that last check is that last fork in the road is theirs to take. Recognizing the fact that each election is different, each set of candidates is different, and they may have had a reason to vote in a Republican primary 4 years ago, and they're voting in a Democratic primary this time around, or vice versa.
Great, thank you. And Paul, I think this one was probably better for you. One thing that was just particularly interesting to me looking at the top lines here is on the Republican side, Jeff Deal leading in the gubernatorial contest, but then Kate Campanale, his opponent's running mate, leading in the LG race. I know on the LG side, those numbers are fairly close. I think like 19 and 13 or something like that. But what does that tell you about the way that candidates run in Massachusetts with these tickets? Does it work, or does this show that maybe voters don't make that same connection?
It's really hard to say. I would say you have the same phenomenon going on in the Democrat primary for lieutenant governor. It just seems like it's an afterthought right now. And I would say, for the Republican primary too, if you look at the bottom of our press release, I think there is a higher margin of error. So I wouldn't read too much into it. It's not like it's not like kind of like a blowout like the Galvin Sullivan one is. But you do see a bit of a bump, and maybe you can just chalk it up to, maybe Worcester County has more Republican primary voters than Essex, or where Leah's kind of based out of. But one thing I would mention, I kind of touched on this, is that, like Jim said, these are people who vote in Republican primaries, who told us on the phone they're going to vote in this Republican primary. And then you look at the Deal Chris Dowdy race, and Deal's at 42. So these are people who are, I would consider pretty solid for a Deal. And then for Allen, they're only at 13. So maybe just the connection hasn't been really made yet. So again, if I was Jeff and Leah, right now be really kind of focusing on making sure that connection is very clear leading into the next few days and then through early voting and on primary day. And then maybe if you're more Healy and you do have a preference, you know, making that preference kind of known directly or indirectly in the next few days is probably what their campaign is thinking for their LG race. Because again, that one seems to be pretty wide open, 72% are undecided. So yeah, I think right now it's just basically it's an afterthought. That's what it seems like to me. And maybe these Republican primary voters are going to start doing their homework in the next few days. And the same thing on the Democrat side.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mhm.
I think that covers it for me.
All right. Well, thanks, Colin.
A
Thank
lot
you
of
both.
pressure on the Colin for the entire fourth estate.
Happy to be the representative.
We may look at doing a general election poll after the primary too, you know, because I always think that after the primary, after Labor Day, people start to pay attention to the November election.
Yeah,
So
the decisions come into focus.
yeah, definitely. So stay tuned on that. And then we will finish this up. Thank you, Jim, for joining us, and everyone else. I know we got some Fiscal Alliance Foundation staff on the call here, but we'll wrap this up and put it online and put the crosstabs, top line, and press release on the Fiscal Alliance Foundation website too. Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Thanks.